This is lecture 20. We are still in 22.4, organs of the female reproductive system in your textbook, and we're still talking about ovaries. So you'll recall we have now, under ovaries, talked about primordial follicles, we've talked about oogenesis, and we're getting into talking now about follicle maturation. Let's run through this section of your handout first, and you'll realize as we go through that you're familiar with all of this information already. And so starting off then, so at puberty, the anterior pituitary gland secretes increased amounts of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, but just FSH is fine, and the ovaries enlarge in response. Primordial follicles, those follicles we talked about last lecture, now mature into so-called primary follicles. And notice what's happened now as this primary follicle has developed. Within it, there's a protein layer, which you'll recall is the zona pellucida, forming around the oocyte. Notice that the oocyte, again, on your lecture outline, is still a primary oocyte, so it has not yet undergone meiosis I. The primary follicle then develops into an even larger structure called a preantral follicle. And again, you'll recall this from the work you did for laboratory. And that preantral follicle in turn develops into a mature antral follicle, sometimes called a Graafian follicle. And you'll also recall then this preantral follicle contains a very large space filled with fluid. The space is called the antrum. Also at this point, recall that the oocyte is now no longer a primary oocyte, but has undergone meiosis I, and so in this mature antral follicle, it's a secondary oocyte. Also then, inside this Graafian follicle, this mature antral follicle, you'll remember a layer of cells called the corona radiata that surrounds the secondary oocyte, that nourishes the secondary oocyte. And also recall at this point, there's a small first polar body that was also produced by meiosis I. So having gone over that, let's take a look now in your textbook at figure 22.22. This is on page 844. I don't think this one was listed or is listed in your lecture outline. And so again, we're looking now at figure 22.22 on page 844. We're looking at the A portion of this figure, so up at the top of the page. And let's just take a quick look at those various stages of primordial development. I'm sorry, of follicle development, actually. And notice in that first line of figures, so right in the middle of 22A, that first line, you can see we're looking at an ovary, just very diagrammatically, and you can see then the development of the follicle going on. You can see that about halfway over, the follicle is being released along with the supporting cells. And of course, this is ovulation. And then you can see again in those very diagrammatic figures, a chunk of the follicle remains behind and eventually degenerates. And now to see more detail and some labeling, let's go to that second row of figures and the labeling down below. And notice then, again, we start with a primordial follicle, which develops into a primary follicle, then into a preantral follicle, and then into a mature antral or Graafian follicle. At this point then, we have ovulation, and so between the numbers 4 and 5, we're seeing ovulation. And again, ovulation, the release of the egg cell, and along with the egg cell, again, the surrounding, and this doesn't all have to into your notes again, certainly, but around the egg cell, remember, there's that surrounding zona or zona pellucida, and around that, there's the layer called the corona radiata. So you should be very familiar with these structures by now. And then again, recall that after ovulation, and so between number 5 and number 6, along that timeline, after ovulation, the portion of the follicle that remains behind in the ovary is called a corpus luteum. And we'll talk about the function of the corpus luteum probably next lecture. And then again, recall and see on the diagram, the corpus luteum eventually kind of shrinks up into a non-functional structure called a corpus albicans. I do want to direct your attention back for just a moment to the previous page. And so on page 843, figure 2221, you'll recall we spent some time last lecture going over oogenesis, but I neglected to point out down below that, so the B part of the figure, there's a very nice photomicrograph showing that very large secondary oocyte, and then with the arrow pointing to the much smaller first polar body that was also produced during meiosis I. So next on your lecture outline, just a quick review of what happens during ovulation. And so ovulation releases the secondary oocyte, the surrounding cells of the corona radiata, and remember that first polar body has now been produced, and that goes along with, that's released along with that secondary oocyte. And as I mentioned last time, I think, the function of this first polar body is just to hold those 23 chromosomes that didn't become part of the secondary oocyte. And then, as we saw in the diagram on the previous page, this first polar body may either disintegrate or it might undergo meiosis II and produce 2 second polar bodies, but both of them then disintegrate. And so basically recall that other than functioning to cut the number of chromosomes from 46 down to 23 in that structure that's been released at ovulation. Other than that, again, there's no real function of these polar bodies. From here now, notice we're getting away from talking about the ovaries. We're still in 22.4, and now we're talking about various female internal accessory reproductive organs. Accessory, they don't produce egg cells. They have other functions. And so let's run through these. And again, most of this will be familiar to you from the work you've done prior to this point. So the uterine tubes also called fallopian tubes or oviducts. And here, and you may recall this from that Miracle of Life video, it's the movement of the cilia that line these tubes along with peristalsis, so two things going on here really, moving the secondary oocyte down the tube. And notice also then that fertilization, if it does occur, will occur in the fallopian tube. In terms of the uterus, you'll recall that we looked at the various layers of the uterus in the laboratory material, and you'll recall then there's this inner lining called this inner layer, if you will, called the endometrium. And notice now we're getting some functional information about that inner layer. And so to your handout, to your lecture outline, the developing embryo enters the uterus from the uterine tube, implants into the endometrium, and there completes its development. In terms of the vagina, notice then three functions. And so first carries menstrual secretions from the uterus, and we'll talk about menstrual cycle probably next lecture or the one after. We're getting close to the end of the chapter, so hang in there. A second function of the vagina then receives the erect penis during intercourse. And then number three, of course, the vagina also functions as the birth canal. Female external accessory reproductive organs, so now on the outside rather than within the body. And you'll recall then we have the labia majora, translating into large lips, if you will. The labia majora enclose and protect the other external reproductive organs. So here now we have a function for these labia majora. Remember then, we have protected by the labia majora the labia minora, so smaller lip-like structures, and forming, again, a protective covering around the clitoris. The clitoris itself then is homologous to, is similar to the penis in males, in that as the penis has erectile tissue and as the penis is richly supplied with sensory nerve fibers at the very tip of the penis, so then the clitoris also has erectile tissue, and so then the clitoris is richly supplied with nerve fibers and very sensitive. And then finally, for this lecture, we have the vestibule, the space enclosed by the labia minora. So this is a term we haven't come across yet. We have mentioned then that there's a pair of vestibular glands in this area, and that they're homologous to the bulbourethral glands in males. So both the vestibular glands and the bulbourethral glands, recall, producing a fluid that helps lubricate during sexual intercourse. And with that, we're done with this lecture, and we'll pick it up next time and get into 22.5, talking about hormonal control of the female reproductive functions.